much, Celia. Thank you for that introduction. So as Celia said, what I will be doing today is that I will talk you through my experience of involving people with intellectual disability in various activities, including at the University of Malta. And I will be making use of some of my publications on this subject. My work in this area, and this is how I want to present it, has largely been an evolutionary process in which I and the people with intellectual disability concerned have developed our skills together, created opportunities, and made the most of the ones that presented themselves, building one achievement on top of the previous one. I am a teacher by training, and here I make use of concepts taken from two thinkers who have had a profound influence on pedagogical practices. First of all, there's Freire and his work on dialogic pedagogy, and Vygotsky and his zone of proximal development. Above all, my presentation is informed by what I have learned from the people with intellectual disability with whom I have worked and still work. So I first provide a briefest of overviews of Freire's and Vygotsky's concepts as they apply to my work, and then present a reflexive account of the relevant work I have done with people with intellectual disability. In the last part of my presentation, I elicit practical pointers that emerge from my reflections for creating inclusive environments for persons with intellectual disability in universities. Freire's work on adopting a dialogic stance in education surely needs no introduction. Since his publication of A Pedagogy of the Oppressed, his work and ideas have been used widely in different educational contexts, including teaching at university. In an article published in 2018, she provides a very useful summary of the main elements of Freirean thought, which very briefly are dialogue, which is based on these premises. Each person has the right to speak. Dialogue is not an act of one person depositing ideas into another, and it is not a hostile and polemical argument. And dialogue comprises love, humility, hope, humor, silence, critical thinking, and faith. Since I am using pedagogical concepts, it is important that I explain who I am considering to be teachers and learners. The most obvious teacher-learning dyad is that of the lecturer and university students. Both can either be non-disabled or have a disability, including an intellectual disability. The other important dyad is that of the lecturer and collaborator with intellectual disability. To some extent, the traditional teacher-learner dyad can be applied also to this relationship. After all, it is the lecturer who has the knowledge and social capital that one needs to teach and research at tertiary level. And in inclusive practices, it is the lecturer who has to support persons with intellectual disability so that they participate meaningfully in teaching, research, and learning. However, in line with the Freirean concept of a dialogic education, the relationship in collaborative work between the lecturer and the person with intellectual disability has to be a reciprocal one. Both have different areas of expertise. The lecturer, by virtue of being an academic who specializes in teaching and research in the area of intellectual disability, and the person with intellectual disability as an expert by virtue of their personal experience of living with an intellectual disability. The two actors in this dyad therefore work together and learn from each other. This reciprocal relationship of teaching and learning is also important, but perhaps not so intuitive, when it comes to applying Vygotsky's zone of proximal development to the context which we are considering today. What I am referring to in particular here is Vygotsky's idea of scaffolding, that is, evaluating the learner's progress, responding to their needs, and presenting them with the next level of difficulty to challenge them and enable them to advance in their learning. In involving people with intellectual disability in tertiary education activities, scaffolding applies for them as much as for the lecturer. If they are both teachers and learners, they both need to progress in their learning, evaluate their progress, and move on to the next challenge. That said, the main direction continues to come from the lecturer, who must therefore also engage in self-reflexive work. In fact, the main points that I hope will emerge from my presentation are: involving people with intellectual disability in university-related work takes planning and preparation. People with intellectual disability need to be supported in this enterprise, and the academic needs to learn how to provide the support in an empowering manner. And using a scaffolding approach enables one to start small and build up, with both parties learning from previous successes as well as previous mistakes. Together, these 3 points mean that it is vital to foster a dialogic relationship, taking the lead in laying the groundwork and providing support while being open to learning from the person with intellectual disability and from the work carried out together. My first opportunity to work with people with intellectual disability as co-equals came in 2003 during the European Year of Persons with Disability. At the time, I was working at the National Commission Persons with Disability, Malta's disability anti-discrimination body, which has since changed its name to the Commission for the Rights of Persons with Disability. In my book, Becoming Self-Advocates, which is based on my PhD, I discuss this work in depth, and what I say here about my self-advocacy work at the Commission is largely taken from the book. In order to include persons with intellectual disability in the activities celebrating the European Year, the Commission set up a committee on self-advocacy. It was felt that there were no people with intellectual disability who had the necessary skills and experience to take a meaningful part in this committee. Consequently, the members, which included myself, were non-disabled professionals and a parent of a person with intellectual disability. The initial activities were thus organized for, rather than by, people with intellectual disability. This reflects the tendency in Malta for major changes in the disability sector to be initiated from the top rather than from the grassroots. Activities organized included a service user group in a day center and a small-scale study with day service users. The findings of this study were presented during a seminar organized together with a group of people with intellectual disability. They were also published in an easy-to-read format, and since then the Commission has produced and continued to produce easy-to-read publications. The next step was Speak Out, a course in self-advocacy skills and public speaking for persons with intellectual disability that was carried out in 2004. Easy-to-read invitations were sent to all disability organizations as well as day centers for people with intellectual disability. Inevitably, the invitation was first read by those in charge of these organizations, who then forwarded it to the parents of people with intellectual disability. This meant that staff and parents of the latter effectively acted as gatekeepers and decided whether or not individuals would benefit from the course. Most of the training sessions were led by a media and communication specialist who had already provided such training for people with physical and sensory impairments, and with whom I discussed in detail to help him prepare. I remember clearly an incident that happened just before the first session. The trainer told me that he was worried that he wouldn't be able to interact adequately with the participants because he didn't know how to speak to people with intellectual disability. And I just said, just be yourself, show them that you respect them, and you'll be fine. Within 10 minutes of the first session, any concerns had dissipated. He was a highly skilled trainer and clearly understood how he needed to adapt his usual methods to suit the individual needs of the participants without being patronizing. Some of those who participated in this course displayed a particularly good aptitude for public speaking and began delivering talks with support from me, among others. These speakers took part in a course to become disability equality trainers. They were also supported to write and deliver speeches for various conferences, seminars, and other meetings. After the end of the Speak Out course, the participants expressed the wish to continue meeting, and as a result, they set up a self-advocacy group. Unlike the other developments described here, this was one where it was people with intellectual disability themselves who took the initiative. And this is an example of how work carried out for people with intellectual disability can evolve into work carried out by people with intellectual disability themselves. Another example of this type of evolution came from the setting up of the Consultative Committee of Persons with Disability of Intellectual Disability within the Commission, known as the KCC. Once again, the KCC started out on the initiative of non-disabled persons. As with the Speak Out course, invitations for people with intellectual disability to become members were sent to disability organizations and service providers. This meant that, once again, parents and staff working with people with intellectual disability filtered the decision as to whether or not the persons concerned should join this committee. The 12 people who applied to join had all participated in previous self-advocacy activities. Thus, those who were given the initial opportunity to participate in these activities found new openings to practice and build on the experiences and skills that they had acquired. I was the non-disabled person involved in the work of the KCC, and at first I was very much in control. I provided a list of topics that we could discuss together, the first of which were the ground rules for proper conduct during the meetings. But while I was in control of the KCC's initial development and the way the meetings proceeded, their participation in the meetings meant that they could acquire new skills that would prepare them for taking on more responsibility and becoming more proactive in the work of the committee. The skills varied from learning what an agenda is and what minutes are and why they are important to an orderly functioning of a committee, to suggesting topics to consider for discussion. They also started engaging more in discussions amongst themselves. So while at first interactions mostly comprised me asking questions and they replying to me, as time went by, there were more exchanges directly between the members. After 1 year of almost monthly meetings, I prepared and delivered presentations on how committees work and the various roles fulfilled by the chair, secretary, and so on. The KCC members went on to select 5 members who were appointed as chair, vice chair, secretary, assistant secretary, and public relations officer. Having these 5 KCC members in these posts brought about significant changes. One of them was that rather than preparing notes for myself, I started preparing the notes in easy-to-read format, which I then distributed to each member. This made it easier for them to follow what was going on in each meeting and tends to take more control. The transition to the members gaining more control was not as smooth as this brief account may make it appear, nor was it flawless. Here I would like to focus on one of the mistakes I made. In the second year of the KCC, I came up with the idea of organizing a seminar for the KCC members to showcase their work. Among those invited to attend were the members' parents and other family members. As far as I was concerned, this was a brilliant idea. since it would enable the members to show their parents and other primary caregivers what they were capable of. As it happened, after the seminar was held, we had an evaluation meeting, and one of the KCC members objected to the parents' presence in the seminar. What I have on the slide are parts of the discussion that ensued. All the names are pseudonyms. So Christina was the first one to raise the issue. And she said, I think we're doing well, but for instance, like the one we did with parents, that is the seminar, that wasn't so good. I didn't agree with it. And Michael said, I think this is a very important point. So I was asking the other members then, and among them I asked Peppa, what do you think? Do you think that there should be family members? And Peppa said, no. Why not? I asked. Because they want to know everything. Aha, what we do then, Christina interjected. They keep interfering. This exchange shows the importance of taking stock, discussing and reviewing. And at least in my case, not assuming that one's ideas are as brilliant as one would like them to be. Despite missteps like this one, the KCC members could exert greater control on the committee, or perhaps it was because of such missteps, in the sense that incidents like these helped me realize when I needed to take a step back. Having greater control led to the KCC members discussing and approving a proposal made by one of the members to invite other people with intellectual disability onto the committee. An invitation was sent by the KCC chair to the same organization which had received the original one. There was one crucial difference, however. Some KCC members also forwarded the invitation directly to their friends. This meant that, unlike with the first invitation, some of the members were recruited directly by people with intellectual disability. The work of the KCC lent itself very well to research activities. The first opportunity in this regard came in 2010, when the British Journal of Learning Disabilities published a call for papers for a special issue of work by people with intellectual disability and their supporters. I and some of the KCC members worked on an article bringing together the outcome of discussions about independent living during the KCC members' meetings. The article, How We Like to Live When We Have the Chance, was published in this special issue. Being involved in this article and seeing it in print introduced a new world to the KCC members, that of research and publications. They were already involved in research, since my work with the KCC was also part of my doctoral research, and the members were my most important research participants. But in that area, I retained control. Collaborating on the journal article involved a few of the members more directly. This led to their suggesting other topics for exploration through research, one of which was sexuality. Since this is not my area of specialization, I recruited a friend of mine, Claire Delane, who is my head of department today, who had just finished her PhD on sexuality and people with intellectual disability. The research comprised 2 committee meetings which served as focus groups. The female members expressed discomfort discussing certain issues in front of the males, and so we agreed to hold another 2 separate meetings. The KCC, Claire and I then held a seminar to present the main topics that emerged from the discussions. Interestingly enough, the members wanted parents to be invited for this seminar, including Christina, who had previously objected to their presence. Presumably, it was a way of getting them to listen to her wishes about this sensitive topic. With the KCC members' consent, Claire and I also published an article constructing sexual identities. Perhaps if we were to write this article today, it would be co-written with the KCC members, but the capacity to do that would come later. At around this time, I was also delivering lectures at the University of Malta on a part-time basis, including on the topic of self-advocacy. For these lectures, I have always involved people with intellectual disability as co-lecturers. it would be completely inappropriate for me to present myself in front of university students to tell them how people with intellectual disability can speak for themselves. This is certainly a case for Marshall McLuhan's adage that the medium is the message. For these lectures, I adopt an interviewing style, using questions as prompts for the person co-delivering to know what they need to speak about. Lectures are delivered to students following different courses, for example, education, social policy, social work, nursing, and other health professions, and also our own masters in disability studies. The content of the interview and hence of the lecture is adapted according to what is of interest to the students concerned. An example is a lengthier focus on education in 4 lectures delivered for student teachers. I eventually took on a full-time post at the University of Malta in the Department of Disability Studies, which is where I am today. And having this post meant that I had the time and the resources to apply more directly myself more directly in research involving people with intellectual disability, not only as participants, but also as co-researchers. I had long been aware of inclusive research, which, as Melanie Nind writes, is based on both emancipatory and participatory research approaches. It is also based on a social model understanding of disability and entails people with intellectual disability being given the support that they need to be co-researchers. Being at university meant that I had the opportunity and the means to engage in inclusive research myself. I have no doubt that my decade-long involvement in self-advocacy at the National Commission Persons with Disability and the experience and insight I gained from my PhD research on self-advocacy in Malta acted as a Vygotskian scaffold for my work in inclusive research. To explain this, I will draw from a research method case study that I wrote for SAGE in 2016, titled Developing Inclusive Research Methods. In it, I described the stepped process of becoming an inclusive researcher. The first step I identify is my work with KCC. The second was the How We Like to Live article, and the third, the research on sexuality, which I have already discussed. The fourth was co-presenting a paper with Isabel Bonello, one of the KCC members, at a disability studies conference in which we focused on inclusive research as a means of empowerment. There happened to be other inclusive research presentations, and as I observed in the SAGE case study, participation in this conference gave us the opportunity to discuss our work with other researchers using an inclusive approach and to learn from their own research presentations. Furthermore, it encouraged me to team up with Isabel on a research project in which she would be a co-researcher. This was in fact the fifth step that I describe in the case study. The research project that Isabel and I carried out was on overprotection, a topic that she chose herself. I obtained funding from the University of Malta for Isabel to be paid for her work on the project. We devised the research plan together, which involved focus groups with people with intellectual disability, parents and staff, formulated the questions that we asked, conducted the groups, and then did the analysis and writing up. There were stages of the project that I conducted myself, for example, applying for research ethics approval and doing the literature review. There were other stages in which Isabel was involved directly but under my guidance. For example, during the focus groups, I told her to omit certain questions because they had already been tackled and we were running out of time. There were also ideas that were entirely Isabel's. For example, including staff as research participants. The focus groups with them, in fact, were very informative. And there were also aspects of the work that we did in direct collaboration with each other. For instance, drawing up the focus group questions, transcribing the focus group recordings, and analyzing the data. Part of the funding for the project provided for our participation in another disability studies conference. This time, Ours was the only inclusive research presentation, and while our experience of presenting was a positive one, the experience of the conference as a whole made me reflect on how such academic conferences remain largely inaccessible for people with intellectual disability. In this account, I hope to have shown how my collaboration with people with intellectual disability has itself acted as a scaffold on which to develop this work. As I said earlier, the scaffolding is necessary for all those involved in inclusive ventures in terms of evaluating the progress of both the academics and the persons with intellectual disability, responding to identified needs, and moving on to the next level of collaboration. In fact, we have now widened our inclusive research team and embarked on a new venture, a project that aims to produce video CVs of people with intellectual disability to promote their employability. One aspect of the involvement of people with intellectual disability in university, which we still need to work on, is that of welcoming them as students. In Malta, they do have opportunities to further their studies in post-secondary vocational colleges, but not as yet at university. For the final part of my presentation, I elicit some take-home points from my discussion, which are applicable to the inclusion of persons with intellectual disability in university, including as students. Here, I return to the essentials of Freudian pedagogy as presented by Xi. I hope to have shown that the dialogic relationship established in my work is based on the premises set out, that is, that everyone can exercise their right to speak, sharing and developing of ideas and knowledge is reciprocal, and what we engage in are discussions and not arguments. This pedagogical approach also requires saint-like virtues, so they are ideals to aspire to without anyone necessarily being able to claim that they have fulfilled them entirely. Love, humility, and humor are tied to having a reciprocal relationship. Hope and faith can be related to the reasons why we seek to include people with intellectual disability in tertiary education as we aspire to build a more inclusive society. As for silence and critical thinking, I think these two are as being very much connected. We need to stop talking and listen. Listen to what people with intellectual disability are telling us, and listen also to ourselves to recognize our own slips and errors. And we need to have moments of silence to engage in that all-important critical thinking and reflection. So here are my points based on my own reflections on including and collaborating with people with intellectual disability as co-lecturers, co-researchers, and students. You will, of course, have your own reflections, which I would like to hear about. You cannot know how much you and your collaborators are capable of until you've tried something out. So start small, but think big. Assessments of persons with intellectual disability can only tell us something about their capabilities and nothing about their wishes and aspirations. Start with what the person would like to do and what they have already learned to do and build on that. Mistakes and failures can become learning opportunities when they are recognized and reflected on. There may be some aspects of work at university that may remain difficult for a person with intellectual disability to grasp, but do not assume that a person cannot do something. Try to find ways of making it accessible. It is better to say, I don't yet know how to support the person to do that thing, rather than that person can't do that thing. Working inclusively takes time. One needs to dedicate time to providing work in a structured manner, creating easy-to-read versions of complex information, and repeating and revising whenever necessary. Keep yourself up to date with the literature about inclusive practices at tertiary level, as well as other practices that can be used at this level. And prepare yourself well and then take the plunge. My final comments are on the inclusion of persons who have very severe cognitive impairments. While people with intellectual disability involved in inclusive work in universities have different levels of impairments, they almost always are ones who are articulate and can express themselves clearly in spoken language and without too much difficulty. This means that people who have very severe intellectual disability, and even more so those who have profound intellectual and multiple disabilities, tend to get left out of such work. There is a lot of varied work being done with such persons at an individual level, but working with them at group level, engaging them in abstract discussions, and involving them in public speaking activities remain difficult to achieve. The same applies to having them enrolled as students at a university. These are difficult aims to achieve, but it is important that we don't lose sight of this population, acknowledge the limitations of our work, and seek ways of pushing the boundaries even further. Thank you.